Hi, and welcome back to the Life in Bomb City podcast. My name is Aaron Favor, and this morning I'm sitting here with Frank Bellizzi and Dr. Brian Ingrassia from West Texas A&M University. Today is a very special morning. This is a special podcast, and our special host this morning is going to be Mr. Frank Bellizzi.
Hello.
And take it away, Frank.
All right. Well, I'm sitting here with a friend and neighbor of mine. It's kind of a strange, unique situation we have where Brian moved into the neighborhood where I live before I moved there. And sometime after that, he came down and introduced himself because he had heard that the guy who lived two doors down was also a history. Well, Brian's a history professor. My title here at AC is I'm a history instructor. And so he came down and introduced himself to me and said, and I heard there's another guy in the neighborhood actually who teaches history at the college level. And I said, yeah. And so that was the beginning of our friendship. So full disclosure, although I'm interviewing Brian this morning, I'm actually the guy who lives two doors down from him as well. And we've known each other for several years and get together every once in a while and talk shop since we're both American historians. Brian has the distinction of having published a book or two and several articles, some of them at least related to the history of the Panhandle Plains and Amarillo, Texas, which is why I thought he would be perfect for this particular podcast. I'm thinking in particular of an article, Brian, and by the way, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Welcome to this special edition of Life in Bomb City, because we're thinking about Amarillo and its history with automobiles, cars, car culture, that sort of thing. And turns out in 2019, Brian published in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly an article called Speed Attractions, subtitle, Urban Mobility and Automotive Spectacle in Pre-World War I Amarillo. I remember when this article came out. I read it at the time. More recently, I've read it again, getting ready for this podcast and kind of thinking about the history of cars and automobility, if I can use that term, here in Amarillo. And I want to start out by talking a little bit and then getting you, Brian, to respond to sort of where this article fits or what it does for the historiography, what's been written about Amarillo and its history. So we know, or most people are aware of the fact that, say by 1890, shortly after Amarillo was born, this new town next to the brand new railroad was one of the busiest cattle shipping points in the world, which is not an exaggeration. So early Amarillo was, among other things, but it's best remembered probably as having been a cow town. And I think a lot of times when people come to Amarillo, they think, well, I've moved to a place that's kind of like this overgrown or somewhat developed since then, of course, cow town. But Brian, you write in your article, quote, less scholarly attention has been paid to how the turn of the century Panhandle embraced modernity. And you say this article fills a significant gap in the history of Texas mobility by focusing on car-fueled pre-World War I growth and culture. And then at the end of the article, you kind of nail it down and put a capstone on it by saying, in fact, Amarillo was a car town as much as it was a cow town, very, very early on. So one of my questions for you, and by the way, it's a splendid article, very, very interesting. We'll get into some of the details of the article, I hope, as we go along. But my first question for you, Brian, is how did you come to recognize that the typical traditional way of thinking about Amarillo in its early years, right, this cow town, that what should be added to that or what should be included is cars, automobiles? How did you realize that, come to that discovery?
Sure. That's a great question. And thanks, of course, for that nice plug about the article. And it's good to be here today and talking about this stuff. The reason why I kind of discovered this and found this to be interesting is, I'm not from this area. I moved here in 2015. I was living outside of Nashville. Before that, I had lived in Atlanta, and I've been working for a number of years now, well over a decade, on a book about the history of Indianapolis and auto racing in Indianapolis. and really kind of talking about the ways that, auto racing as a spectacle is something that it tends to develop in places that are not, I don't know how to put it, they're not on water, right? They're not on navigable water. And so these are places that develop technologies, overland technologies about moving people quickly from place to place. And those tend to be the places that develop automotive spectacle. And when I came to Amarillo, I didn't have the kind of preconceived notion that this was a cow town. I got here and I was looking for a place to live, and I was looking at, the way the city was laid out, and I started noticing, oh, wow, this is a place that's very much focused on automobiles and automobility. And, I was reading Paul Carlson's great book on Amarillo and said, oh, well, he has about a paragraph in there about some auto races that happened about 1909 or 1910. And I said, wow, that's like the exact same moment that Indianapolis is starting up its auto races. I bet there's more of a story here than just one paragraph. So I started doing a little bit of poking around, found more about the races, but also started noticing, of course, like in other places, auto racing really emerges at the same moment that people are using cars for lots of other purposes, not just to have fun and enjoy themselves, but to get from place to place, to have kind of basic, what I call urban mobility. And so that's kind of where that particular article was born, out of a more general desire to see how automobility fits into the history of this interesting place, but really kind of finding those auto races in about 1909, 1910, and then saying, hey, how does that fit into some of these other things going on right about the same time?
Really interesting. So your study of cars in other places, and then kind of recognizing that there are, in certain ways, Indianapolis is kind of like Amarillo in that it's, kind of landlocked to a degree, Amarillo even more so. So cars would be very, very important to this place. And then your experience of like, hey, it doesn't look like people walk or ride bicycles very much in Amarillo, Texas.
Sure.
They're going here, there, and yonder in their SUVs and their pickups instead. You also have this to say in the article, and again, I'm quoting, quote, the Panhandle may have been a natural place for cars to gain popularity and fulfill transportation needs. Flat, hard soil made it easy for motorists to take swift trips over the plains. So the flat, hard ground in and around Amarillo actually made it a place that was very friendly to cars before paving was common in America. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about, this is well beyond the time we're talking about here, but there's a 1973 land use study for the city of Amarillo, where they use the phrase at one point that Amarillo has the freedom to sprawl, which I think says a lot about kind of the usage of land in this area, that there aren't a lot of natural barriers to expansion. I mean, I guess there's the canyon and there's the Canadian River breaks, but other than that, it's flat. Like you said, it's hard soil. People pretty quickly realize, this is a relatively easy place to build an infrastructure that's based on automobiles. Say, compare it to a place like Chattanooga, Tennessee, which of course becomes a very, very important kind of node in the Dixie Highway network stretching from the Midwest down into Florida. But like Chattanooga, of course, has automobiles, but like that's the place, they say at least, that's the place where the tow truck was invented, because, if you have an accident on one of those hills, it's going to be hard to get your car back out of there. Whereas Amarillo, the plains in general, it's flat. There's all this room to expand, and also with people being spread out so far, it's actually really helpful to have this technology that's not reliant upon rails. Of course, Amarillo wouldn't exist without the railroad. Basically, that's why it's there. And so once you have the railroad, you have these ground-based transportation technologies that aren't dependent upon water. It's a really convenient place to use this kind of technology to get from place to place.
Sure, and if your car breaks down, you don't have to worry about it rolling away. That's
unless you're on the edge of the canyon, which that does happen sometimes around 1909, 1910.
A few over the edge experiences at the time
down around Canyon.
Yeah. You begin the article. I want to go back to the very beginning of this article that you published back in 2019. You start by describing an auto race here in Amarillo in 1910. And you say, quote, Amarillo's new speedway held a 3-day auto racing event. Who would have thought that this cowtown in 1910 had a 3-day auto racing event? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. And kind of the bigger context is that the Indianapolis Motor Speedway opens in like June of 1909. First thing there is actually a balloon contest. It's not an auto racing contest. But by August, July, August, they're doing motorcycle and automobile racing contests. And like every city around America practically is like, yeah, we need one of these. And Amarillo is apparently no exception, because by about August of 1909, they are doing auto races. And I'm almost certain that they're inspired by what they're reading about coming out of Indianapolis. The original track where they're doing these races is around a playa lake, west of present-day Georgia Street. And then they figure out, I think, that playa lakes maybe aren't the most dependable place to have an auto race, because, when it's dry, that's going to be a really good place to race cars. And then if you get a little bit of rain, or if it gets muddy or something, the weeds start growing, this maybe not going to be so good. So by 1910, they build a track down by Glenwood Electric Park, which is kind of this early like electrified amusement park, kind of at the end of the streetcar line on the kind of south edge of town. I think kind of about where Llano Cemetery is at now.
All right. So quite a spectacle in Amarillo's early history. And at that time, you tell us in the article, it was standard for a race car to have aboard not just one person, the driver, of course, but someone else. What was the name of this other passenger or person in a race car, and what was that person doing?
The mechanician, as they were usually called, or the driving mechanic sometimes. So this is a guy who's there. I mean, they don't really have, mirrors much yet at this point in time. So he's there almost as kind of a spotter. If you need to add oil to the engine in the middle of the race, that's his job. It's just kind of an all-purpose utility guy. In 1911, when the first Indy 500 is driven, the guy who wins, he's famous for not having a riding mechanic. Sorry, I said driving earlier. It's a riding mechanic. But he also does have a rear view mirror, which is supposedly the first rear view mirror. It's probably not, but it's one of the first instances of a rear view mirror. Eventually at Indianapolis, they stop using a riding mechanic, although in the 1930s they do reintroduce it, and you have to have two people in each car. But yeah, it's very common in those 1909, 1910 races in places like Amarillo to have both the driver and the mechanician, or the riding mechanic.
That's fascinating, and I can only imagine what it was like to add oil to the engine in the middle of a race. So you're traveling at 70, 80 miles an hour, and here's a guy trying to add oil.
It's a dangerous sport.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, anytime there was any crash or whatever, you've involved at least two people,
at least,
and not just the driver. Harrowing experiences. You mentioned in the article that, so if we want to identify the first car in Amarillo history, it's owned by a local physician named W.A. Lockett, who has a car in 1904. I believe it was a Cadillac?
It was a 1903 model Cadillac.
All right.
Made in Michigan.
But then by 1909, Amarillo, this progressive era city, goes along with the standards of progressivism and insists on cars being registered here. And by 1909, you tell us, there are 150 registered cars in Amarillo, Texas. Take it from there. So then coming into the 1910s, let's say, and the era later on of the Great War, which, of course, most people today call World War I. What happens in Amarillo in connection with cars? I imagine it's just more of the same, just exponential growth. But what can you tell us about that?
Sure, and I forget the exact year, but somewhere around 1915, I think there's like 900 cars registered. And that's partly, it's not just a local registration, it's state-mandated registration after about 1907.
Okay.
So that's something that's happening all around the state. And I think one of the things that, I noticed as I was writing this article is that historians of Texas in general, they don't talk a lot about automobiles before about the 1920s, or even sometimes before the 1950s. And when they do, it's kind of like, farmers liked cars, because it helps them get to cities, or, kind of maybe a mention of the flappers in the 1920s or something. But if you look at a city like Amarillo, it really shows us that cars are becoming a really important part of the city life well before 1917. And of course, that's happening in other cities too, in Dallas or Houston or other cities, but historians haven't really talked about it. But Amarillo is a good place for kind of seeing how that's happening. People are registering their cars. They're buying their cars. Of course, 1908, the Model T is introduced by Henry Ford, but not everybody's buying a Ford. There are all these brands that are being produced in Michigan, in Indianapolis, maybe in Illinois, New York. And so there are people buying cars made all over, but also cars are being very useful for just getting around this kind of spread out area. It's been documented that, around 1909 or so, there are all these people coming out to Amarillo from, say, Indiana or Illinois, and they want to buy land. They want to move out kind of into the panhandle. And then what's happening is agents are meeting them at the train station saying, okay, I'll show you this land out here. And they drive them like 20 miles out in a car. Well, somebody who's maybe not used to riding in a car that much, they're going to be like, oh, it's really quick to get from Amarillo out to this land I'm buying. And then it's only after they actually move out here and they get on land, they're like, oh, I'm 20 miles out from the city. And basically, if you want to get back to the city, then you're going to have a car. And so it's becoming just such a kind of a common part of life then.
And so the trip out to the real estate was probably deliberately fast in order to make sure that this illusion that you're actually not too far from the city, that was probably good salesmanship.
Most likely, yeah.
Most likely. In your research, have you discovered much about what was either typical or unique about Amarillo car culture, let's say during the interwar years and the years of the Great Depression? So we're talking about the 1920s, which is, I suspect most Americans, when they think about American history, they think, cars becoming a common phenomenon in the United States. That's the 1920s. And then, of course, the 1930s and the Great Depression put a kind of a dent in that development or what. But what is typical or maybe unique in Amarillo with regard to those years and cars?
Sure. That's a really good question, because I think, when I think of automobile-focused cities, I think of like Los Angeles, and I think a lot of us would think of LA as like kind of the city that's built on cars. I would say in some ways Amarillo is almost kind of a better example. It's not, it's not as big of a city as Los Angeles. It's not as internationally known in some ways, but, look at the fact that Amarillo is kind of rare because it actually has automobiles before it has streetcars. And if you look at certainly any city east of the Mississippi River or any kind of older city in the West, you're going to have streetcars by about the 1890s. Very extensive streetcar systems in, say, Chicago, Indianapolis, Richmond, Virginia by the 1890s. Amarillo doesn't see its first streetcar operating until about 1908. So if you want to get around Amarillo before 1908, you basically either need, a horse or a car, or you're going to be walking. And so cars become very well established before streetcars do, and the streetcars don't last very long. 1908 is when they start operating. They're basically out of business by 1926. The first buses are being introduced by 1927. The streetcars never go back into business. When we talk about a city that ditches streetcars in favor of the automobile, we usually talk about Los Angeles doing that in 1946. 20 years before Los Angeles gets rid of its streetcars, Amarillo gets rid of its streetcars. And so people, again, if you want to get around this kind of sprawling city, automobiles can be the best way to do that after about 1926, even before 1926, but certainly after 1926.
I'm smiling because as you were saying that, I was sitting here looking at another quote from your article, and and this is what you said, quote, "The largest city of the Texas Panhandle was an automotive pioneer." And so you're filling in some of the details there.
I think so.
Yeah.
Something else to consider is that 1926 is the year that Route 66 basically comes to town. The original alignment through 6th Street is officially designated, I believe, in 1926. So this important signifier of automobile culture, Route 66, is coming through town at the very moment that the town is becoming, the city of Amarillo is becoming almost entirely dependent on automobiles for mobility.
So you've sort of already answered this question, but I want to go ahead and ask it anyway. And that is, now my wife and I enjoy pedaling around on our bikes. But we've noticed, of course, that in Amarillo, it's not particularly safe or easy to ride bicycles. And my question is, how much of that do you think is typical of the U.S. today? And how much of that is directly related to the fact that Amarillo, Texas, really grows up during the progressive era and has always been very much, as you pointed out, a car town?
Yeah, I mean, the irony is that the first people who wanted good roads and like hard streets were bicyclists. Like if you go back to the late 1800s, the first people who initiate what we call the good roads movement are like members of the League of American Wheelmen, who they say we need better streets, better roads so that we can ride our bicycles. But then, of course, by about 1904, 1905, automobiles very much become kind of take over those streets. And then they become thoroughfares. Like I always tell my students, if you go back and look at like a picture of, say, a street in downtown New York in the late 1800s or something, you're going to see not, my students are like, well, you're going to see horses and wagons, carriages. I'm like, well, yeah, but you're also going to see people like standing around in the middle of the street, because streets are gathering places. They're not thoroughfares. Like we can't do that today. Like I'm teaching a canyon and I'm like, I can't go out in the middle of 4th Avenue and just like stand there and like try to teach my class, because that's not how we use streets anymore. We use them as thoroughfares. And a lot of that's because we've become so dependent on automobiles, and bicycles kind of at a certain point become kind of known as a technology more for children than for adults. And I think, of course, we've some people are trying to change that, but yeah, I think a lot of cities become very quickly become very dependent on automobiles to the point where it excludes any other kind of usage of city streets. Now, historians have kind of gone back and looked at, say, cities like Pasadena, California, and they do have bike paths around the turn of the century, around to the 1890s, early 1900s. But very quickly, they basically say, yeah, there's no need in investing in a lot more of these because everybody's using cars instead of bicycles.
Wow, very interesting. And so this emphasis on good streets, good roads, paving, that sort of thing, leads me right into something that you mentioned in the article, and that is when you look around in Amarillo, Texas, you see a lot of brick paved streets. So in Wolfland, downtown, of course, many miles, I would say, of brick paved streets here in Amarillo. And how would you relate that to the story of cars and automobiles in this city?
Yeah, there's a good 1981 historic building survey for Amarillo where they say that Amarillo may have more visible brick streets in 1981 than any other city of its size in the United States, which I think is really amazing. And, in the town where I grew up in Illinois, we had some brick streets. And so I noticed those when I first came here, but I didn't know the history. I'm just like, wow, these are old bricks. And then I got doing some of this research. And what I discovered is it's in the spring of 1910 that the city of Amarillo votes to take out about a $75,000 bond issue in order to pave streets in downtown and in surrounding residential neighborhoods with brick. I think the Chamber of Commerce says we should take out $125,000, but they only do $75,000. And these are bonds bought by investors in New York and Chicago and places like that. But what's really amazing about that is that if you put it in the context of what's going on just literally like 6 months earlier, it's in September and October of 1909 that the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the Brickyard as we all know it, that's when it gets paved with brick, because it's originally tar and gravel. The first races at Indianapolis are so deadly. I mean, just people are going off the track. They're creating ruts that are dangerous. And they realize they're either going to have to close the thing down or they're going to have to do something. And they experiment. They do tests. They figure out what's the best paving material. And they say, let's do bricks. And they buy 3.2 million bricks from various Indianapolis brick manufacturers. And they put them down. And all of a sudden, they're like, okay, it's a much safer place. We can go higher speeds. Now, today, brick is not probably our most cutting edge paving technology, but in 1909, 1910, it really is. And that's the exact moment that Amarillo does that puts down those brick streets that we've probably all seen in and around downtown. And it's partly because everybody is starting to use automobiles, and they figure that's kind of the best thing that they can use for automobiles is to put these paving bricks down.
Absolutely fascinating. So basically at the same moment in U.S. history when the Brickyard is becoming the Brickyard, Amarillo, Texas is saying, hey, let's pave lots and lots of streets with bricks.
1911, I think, is when most of those bricks go down. And it's interesting because, if you go read, say, the Good Roads magazines, the trade magazines from the early 1900s, they're actually quoting engineers who are saying things like, well, these speedways like the one in Indianapolis, they're, of course, being built for the purposes of auto racing, but they're actually serving as almost like a laboratory where we can see just how quickly and efficiently cars can move over land if they have a good paving technology. And they're basically saying, yeah, let's watch what's happening in Indianapolis, and cities around the country are going to do the same thing. And Amarillo is a good example of that. Not the only one, but a very good example of a city that immediately says, yeah, let's do that. Let's put down bricks, and it'll be better for people to get around the city.
Absolutely fascinating. So you see a lot of the spirit of the progressive era alive and well.
Absolutely.
In Amarillo at the beginning of the 20th century. Anything else from that article as you remember your research and what you wrote there that you would want to highlight or emphasize, or maybe something I haven't asked about?
Oh, wow. I think kind of the larger connections that we're seeing to other places. They would do not just in Texas, but they would do these what they called endurance contests in the early 1900s. Sometimes they're called Glidden Tours, sponsored by Charles Glidden out of Boston, where they would, it's not a race exactly, but people would, get in their cars and see how far they could drive basically without breaking down. And Amarillo was on the route of a couple of those. There's one in particular that went from, I believe, Denver down to Mexico City in the early 1900s. We're starting to see these highways that are being built across the country, not just Route 66, but some of these named highways. And people are saying, hey, we should get these highways through this city. And really people, local boosters especially, are starting to talk about Amarillo as this kind of like highway center for Texas. They're kind of envisioning it as this kind of centrally located place. Today, we recognize it's not a Houston or a Dallas in terms of size, in terms of transportation centrality, but they're anticipating this notion that it is kind of an important point where people can travel through on their ways to other places.
Very interesting. Super interesting. You also have published an article more recently in 2020. You had published in the Panhandle Plains Historical Review an article titled, and I know we're not here to talk about baseball, but the title of this article was "The Yellow City's Tenuous Hold on the Gold Sox," subtitled "Affiliated Texas League Baseball in Amarillo, 1959 to 1982." And the reason I mention that is I just wonder what other Amarillo Panhandle history projects do you have in the works? Maybe a publication I've missed. What else have you written about Amarillo in this area that might be of interest to our listeners, and something already published or something in the works?
Sure. Yeah, it was a lot of fun to write that baseball article. Where it actually started was, I went to a whole bunch of Sod Poodles games in 2019, and right about the time they won the Texas League Championship, I was talking to somebody, and they're like, yeah, back in the 60s, we packed people into Potter County Memorial Stadium, and it was great. And I was like, I actually don't think they were quite that successful in packing people into that stadium. So I said, I should do the research and find out if that's actually what was happening or not. And so it was a lot of fun to write that. And by the way, as we're speaking, it is Sod Poodles opening day. I'm pretty excited about that.
Sod Poodles opening day.
But
2022.
What I think is interesting, again, where we can see kind of national trends manifesting themselves locally, is if you look at Potter County Stadium, which opens in the early mid 1950s. I saw some games at Potter County Stadium when I first moved here, and it was a little sad in terms of the condition of the stadium. It was a fun place to go see a game, but not, let's say, not deluxe accommodations exactly. But back in the mid 50s, that was cutting edge. The people who built that, they went up to, I think, Denver, and they went down to Dallas to see what like a really good minor league stadium was. And if you look at like the trends in Major League Baseball stadium construction in the 1950s, this is totally following it. Early 1950s, Milwaukee builds County Stadium, and that's how they're able to get the Braves to relocate from Boston out to Milwaukee. That's the first Major League franchise to relocate in 50 years. They move out to Milwaukee. People love it, but what's really significant about that stadium is it's one of the first kind of suburban Major League stadiums. It's out on the edge of town. It's surrounded by giant parking lots where the good people in Milwaukee love to go out and tailgate and drink beer and eat sausages and things like that. I mean, look at where they put Potter County Stadium, because the previous stadiums, they'd had one downtown, and then they built another one later at the fairgrounds, and then Potter County Stadium replaces that one at the fairgrounds. But to get to the fairgrounds, how do you get there in the 1950s? You got to drive. It's very much, I don't know if I'd call it suburban exactly, but it's kind of an edge city stadium that's dependent on automobiles to get out there to see the sport. Now, of course, recently we're following a late 20th, early 21st century trend of building Hodgetown downtown as kind of part of I don't know if I want to call it urban renewal strategy exactly, but certainly kind of as an attempt to kind of build up downtown.
Downtown revival project.
It's just like a Camden Yards or something that's designed to kind of bring people back into downtown as opposed to funneling them out to the edge of town, like Potter County Stadium.
And so I suppose that when Amarillo looked at places like Oklahoma City or Memphis, they say, hey, it's working there. It seems to be working pretty well in those places. So why not here?
I have a student right now who's writing a research paper about the Oklahoma City AAA Stadium, Bricktown Stadium, that's built in the 1990s, and I suspect that that's probably one of a number of models that Amarillo is looking towards when they build Hodgetown. Start talking about 27. Well, not start talking about it, but start breaking ground about 2017 or 2018.
So, Brian, we've been going, basically chronologically through the history of cars, automobility, car culture, streets, that sort of thing. Here in Amarillo. And so from taking it from there and going forward, what would you say about what happens to cars and car culture and streets and that sort of thing in the very important, these boom years that follow the end of the Second World War? So post 1945, Amarillo, what does that look like? What are the major developments? What changes things in this city with regard to cars?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of post-1940 growth, kind of in Western cities in general, but especially in Amarillo because of Pantex, because of the Air Force Base. I mean, the growth in the 1950s is just unbelievable. You can see that, of course, in terms of how much of the housing stock of this city still dates from probably about, 1948 to about 1964, right? That probably 16-year period has so many houses. But you can especially see this. Let's say if you looked at 3 highways built in, around, or through the city in the post-World War II period. And first of all is, we talked earlier about Route 66, the old alignment on 6th Street. But of course, by the 1950s, that moves out to Amarillo Boulevard. Because before the 50s, only part of Amarillo Boulevard is there. Only part of that is Route 66. But then later, it basically bypasses the city and goes around the city. And if you go, of course, if you've ever driven Amarillo Boulevard, especially kind of out towards like the VA hospital and stuff, basically it's almost like a kind of trial run for the interstates. That's how they're starting to build these bypasses in the post-World War II period. You can see this in other Route 66 towns like Bloomington, Illinois. You've got these kind of proto-interstates kind of going around the city. But then by the mid-1950s, cities are saying, okay, we need expressways. And so the Canyon Expressway starts out as a state-funded limited access highway in the 1950s. It's not complete until about 1960s or so, but they're building that. And there are some neighborhoods where you can see, it goes from the highway kind of cuts through the middle of a neighborhood to the neighborhood is built around the Canyon Expressway. And that's where you start to see that highway is being planned and the developers are actually building around it. And then, of course, by the 1960s, then you've got Interstate 40 kind of cutting right through the middle of the city. And there were some serious debates. Probably some people listening to this maybe even remember some of this. There were serious debates about where they were going to put Interstate 40. Some people wanted it kind of bypass the fairly, well-heeled neighborhoods that it eventually does go through. And there were some lawsuits. You can actually find like the addresses of people on like Wolflin Avenue who were suing the state and suing the city of Amarillo over where to put Interstate 40. Now, eventually the engineers went out and they cut it right through the middle of the city. They say, well, that's going to be more efficient for driving. People are going to use less gas getting through the city. It's better for the state to put the highway where they do, but there's some serious fighting against that. And of course, they tear down a lot of houses where that turbine interchange is. Present-day I-27, the Canyon Expressway, and Interstate 40, that was a neighborhood. And like there was an 82-year-old woman and her daughter and their cats that, get evicted in 1964. It's reported in the newspaper, and the sheriff is kind of like, this is the price of progress, but maybe it's kind of too much price for progress. And there's like one family I'm thinking of in particular. It was a Santa Fe Railway brakeman named, the last name of the family was Ryan. And you can actually kind of see how Amarillo is growing southwestward if you look at where they're moving, because they had lived, I forget exactly which street it is, but it's one of the streets named after a president. And it's right there by US 87. And in about 1955, when they're building the Canyon Expressway, their street gets torn down basically for an on-ramp to the Canyon Expressway. So they moved to the neighborhood right about 34th and Georgia, house built in 1955. So they're kind of moving out along the Canyon Expressway. And then by about 1956 or 1957, well, John McCarty comes along and he buys section 229 down a little bit farther southwest, just west of Georgia Street. And he starts building a new subdivision. And John McCarty decides he's going to give away a house in his new subdivision. It's called the Millionaire's Christmas. You can register at the Piggly Wiggly. You can register at, the local insurance company or whatever. And the Ryan family wins John McCarty's giveaway, and he thinks nobody's going to take it because, well, you're going to have to pay all these taxes. Well, the Ryan family's pretty well established. They're able to pay the taxes. They go take this fully furnished home that's worth probably $360,000 in today's money, about $35,000 or $36,000 in 1956 dollars, and they move once again out to another brand new subdivision that's being built along the Canyon Expressway. And I think that's a good way of kind of seeing how cars and highways and this kind of expansion in the 1950s, this very rapid expansion, is moving people farther and farther from the kind of downtown old neighborhoods out into these new kind of edge city neighborhoods.
So let me set up this next question by mentioning a couple of things. So, Brian, you're an American historian who moved to Amarillo, Texas several years ago because you were the newly named professor of history at WT, and you've been doing that ever since. And so after moving here, you decided, hey, among my various research projects, I'm just going to look at local history and think about local baseball and local car culture and that sort of thing. And so, and you've got these two publications that we've already talked about. And my question is, do you plan maybe eventually to produce a book about the history of this city or the region around Amarillo?
Yeah,
could that be in the works?
Yeah, I'm still working on non-Amarillo stuff. I'm trying to get this Indianapolis book published, and I've got something on Dallas-Fort Worth that's coming out. I've really moved a lot into urban history the last few years. But yeah, I definitely would like to do a book that's kind of 20th century kind of urban planning and automobility in Amarillo. I might try to lift a title from Terry Allen and call it like Amarillo Highways or something like that. But yeah, I'd love to do that and kind of talk about, especially in the post-World War II period, how the city very much develops kind of towards the southwestern part of the city around suburbia. If you think about the fact now, where's the center of population in Amarillo? It's not downtown. It's not even close to downtown. It's probably, I would guess, somewhere around the Puckett subdivision or Paramount or one of those areas. That's really where the center of the city is at. And that's very much it kind of starts in the 20s, but very much a post-World War II phenomenon, especially when the Canyon Expressway is built in the 1950s, that people are kind of moving towards the southwestern edge of town. And I'm just kind of fascinated by the way this is a city kind of entirely built around automobiles, and one that people... I think when people think of the history again of this area, they think cattle ranching and maybe, we think of irrigating and agriculture. We think of oil and natural gas, and those things are super important. But I also kind of I think it's good to think of this as a place that's kind of built around these modern concepts.
Very interesting, and I can only say thanks for kind of like highlighting this since forgotten aspect of early Amarillo history. That's like basically what good historians do.
Thanks.
And I also want to say, I just really admire and appreciate your productivity as an historian. I mean, you're always at it. You're always working, and conducting research and reading other people's work. And you're in the primary sources, you're in the secondary sources, and writing good history. So that's a great contribution, not just to the field of American history, but much more specifically to the history of this area, which our listeners are interested in.
Yeah.
So if you're so inclined, go look up the name Brian M. Ingrassia. And find some of the work that he's produced in the time that he's been in this area about this place, and we'll look forward to more of that in the future.
Thank you very much.
You
Appreciate
bet.
it.
You bet.